Good evening, listeners. You are tuned into WWT radio station, and this is The Phantom Myth, with me, your host, Priscilla Phantom. If you've been listening to the last few episodes, or have happened to pass through the park around then, you will know that Arthur Smith briefly went missing. He is, for anybody listening, the man who lives in the park and often announces to us that the end is nigh. We're not certain where he was for that brief period of time, but I am happy to announce that he is still around, and he seems to be in high spirits, despite his rather depressing message about world annihilation. He and Amelia Sparrow have actually built up a group of around 10 members and counting in the last 4 weeks, who meet to discuss the paranormal and the extraterrestrial. I don't know whether to be concerned or happy that so many people want to explore that which I find so fascinating, even if our opinions of the subject differ massively. We have received a letter from the elusive Edith Horn, or Beatrix, as she likes to be called. I thought it prudent that we read it out loud for you all to hear. We have, of course, given the original to the police, and actually they asked for the copy as well. They didn't ask for it or realise that I had made the second copy. They didn't explicitly tell me not to read this letter out. So I think that's a loophole. Don't you, listeners? This is Beatrix's strange letter. Okay, here goes. Dear darling Priscilla, I'm writing to inform you that I will, in fact, be making a visit soon. Very soon. Sorry for the short notice, but I can't wait to meet you in person. Don't worry, I won't be unannounced. I'll make sure I knock first. Well, my dear, I guess you need a story for your little show. I'm sure I have a story to spare. I know just the one. I met a woman. Her name was, well, I don't quite remember her name. Not anymore. Let's call her Patience. Now, Patience was a kind soul, quite unlike me, I assure you. She was religious, and at the time I was too. I guess I still am religious, but my God is decidedly more, just more. This was a while ago, the 17th century, maybe somewhere first few decades, or maybe not. I'm not foolish enough to give you an exact date. She was sweet and courteous, but troubled. She would pray and plead to the Lord for deliverance, for rest, for him to smite her demons. Oddly enough, I was not one of her demons. Don't be mistaken. I was hers. I just wasn't a demon. Patience was. She was my friend. I cared about her. This, of course, was in the days before I became whatever I am now, and long before I wore the skin of this Edith Horn. As you said, Priscilla, the monsters that lurk in the shadows are human. You were right, in a way. Most of them are, or used to be. But that was a long, long time ago. Patience was a bit like you, my dear Priscilla. In one way, at least. She was sweeter, of course. She saw things. She saw the monsters that roam this world. One night, she woke and she turned to me and told me that in her dream, she saw me. But I wasn't me. My face had changed, and I had changed beneath it. I told her it was just a nightmare, and I held her until she fell asleep. I used to do sweet things like that when I had a soul, when I cared. Oh, how I have changed. But this story isn't about me. It's about a girl who could see what she was never meant to. One day in early spring, still a bit cold out if I remember rightly, a witch-finder came to town. He was paid a handsome sum for each witch he found. Of course, I was scared, as all the smart people were, or at least the smart women were. He came to church to introduce himself to us all. He had an abyss for eyes and jagged yellow teeth and thin lips that seemed to sneer as he spoke. He told us his name was Matthew Sladen, and that if we were all good Christian people, that we claimed to be, we would be safe. But if we had any information, we should come to him. Patience told me she feared the face the witch-finder wore under his mask. I asked what she meant by that. She turned to me and said that he wears a mask of righteousness, but that mask was covering something terrible, something cruel. Now, I'm sure, as you know, in a small community, the rumour mill never stops churning. Patience was a kind soul, but quiet and reserved. She preferred her own company to most others, and the feeling was mutual. When even she was a baby, she was regarded as strange. People said she would look past them when they tried to play with her. She grew up and spoke about monsters. I remember her telling us all when we were all young. Our teacher, Miss Bloomfield, said that, yes, there were monsters out there, but if we stayed on the path that God had set out for us, we would all be safe. But if we strayed too far from that path, we would find ourselves in hell with the monsters we feared so much. I still remember little Patience, my only friend, tugging on Miss Bloomfield's sleeve and insisting that no, she did see the monsters, and they were stalking through the woods and standing hunched in the shadowy corners. I also remember the look on Miss Bloomfield's face. As a child, I didn't have a word for that expression I saw on her face. But now I think the best way to describe it is abject terror. At the time I thought she feared the monsters too, but I was wrong. Although the nature of the relationship Patience and I shared was a well-kept secret, the town, our friends and family, our neighbours and the people we cared about had already filled the witch-finder in enough about Patience that we decided to run. For as long and as far as it took to leave this fear and distrust behind us. As I'm sure you have guessed, it didn't happen. Those ignorant bastards told him we were leaving, and apparently my neighbour, Bernice, a nosy, cruel-spirited woman, overheard us and just ran to tell that horrible, horrible man. She was taken away. I fought for her. I broke the witch-finder's nose, a fact that I am still quite proud of. When it healed, it never set right, and he would spend the rest of his pathetic, short life with a crooked nose, a sign that I had hurt him. Me, a short, malnourished girl, had scarred this big, scary man. They still took her away, dragging her away from me, and threw her in a cart and drove off. I ran 3 miles to the jailhouse, but of course, they didn't let me see her. I stayed and waited and begged and pleaded with anyone who might listen, but my words fell upon apathetic ears. Her trial took place a day later. I waited outside the courthouse, quiet and still, seething with wrath amongst a sea of cheering idiots. This was a show to them. Supposed justice, my pain, her death, was just a play, entertainment, something to distract them from their wretched lives. Patience was dragged out, rope around her wrists, her arms covered in cuts, her fingers bent at angles that they shouldn't be bent at. Beneath the rope, her skin was red raw. Her face, her beautiful face. The light was gone from her eyes, replaced by a distant stare. Her lips were dry and chapped, and her usual rosy cheeks looked pale and shallow. My dear, darling Patience, what had they done to her? They dragged her down to the Duncan stool and tied her onto the chair. I prayed to God, or Satan, to the creature that lurked in the dark, to the witches and the angels and the demons, to whoever might be listening, that she may somehow be saved. The chair went down. Bubbles rose to the surface. The chair came back up and Patience was gasping for air. But before she could get her breath back, the chair was plunged back into the water. I stood and I watched this scene play over and over and over, like some horrific nightmare I couldn't wake up from, trying desperately to think of some way I could save her. But I was, ultimately, helpless. I couldn't save the person I loved. I couldn't save anyone. I couldn't save myself. But then again, I never really tried to save myself. I never wanted to be saved. And eventually it was over. And as Patience sat gasping for air, that cruel man stood over her and screamed to the crowd. He ruled that she must be a witch. I cried, while the town cheered. She was thrown back in her cell, and I prayed and prayed and prayed for her salvation as the town built a pyre in the square. They started the next day, and I watched from the window of my home, refusing to leave the house, refusing to surround myself with those people, the killers and the culpable, and the idiots and the enablers. Men and women collected the wood and arranged them around the stake in the centre, as carefully and particular as if they were building a house. They seemed jolly in their work, almost as if they truly believed they were killing a spawn of the devil rather than the kind woman I knew. They brought her out to the pyre to be burned. It took 6 men to hold me back, but she didn't struggle as they led her out. I remember that. She glanced over at me. In her eyes, no hope, and she looked tired and hollow. They tied her to the stake and lit the wood beneath her, and the town watched and held their breath as the flames climbed up toward her. I watched her burn, my tears making tracks in the dirt that covered my cheeks. Like I said, I cared once upon a time. As I watched the flames lick at her screaming face, I felt myself, my humanity, die. I glanced over at Witchfinder Sladen, the man responsible for such agony and suffering. The fire was reflected in his hollow eyes as he smiled. I saw his true face. I knew what patience had meant. He wore a mask of righteousness, but beneath it, his face did not look human. The Honourable Mr. Sladen would have, of course, burnt me as a witch if he could have gotten his hands on me. But after that day, he never saw me again. But I saw him every day of his miserable life. From then on, I lurked in the shadows. I became vengeance and nothing more. I followed that man for the rest of his life. I killed whoever he cared for. I took whatever things he cared about. He died decades later, old and shriveled and penniless. He smelled bad and he looked worse. He was pathetic, grovelling on the floor, a filthy wretch. And myself? I looked the same. I still looked the same. I was corrupted by my vengeance, and I have never been so thankful for anything since. Some call me mad. I just think I can see what you can't. But wouldn't you be if you could see what you can't comprehend? I apologize. That was a silly question to ask of you, darling Priscilla. Why else would you have shut yourself off from us so completely? Well, this was horrible but fanciful story. Beatrix was not alive in the 1600s. She is delusionally created in the mind of one Edith Horn, a very sick girl who needs help. There are no terrifying beasts for patients to see, although I imagine she herself was also just a figment of Miss Horn's troubled mind and not based on any real person at all. Witchfinders were cruel men who either believed their cruelty was in the service of God, or they were simply greedy or sadistic by nature. Whilst it is true that they hid behind their righteousness, Their real face was very much human. I think this story goes to show the extent of Miss Horn's illness, and I hope she is sent to an institution to recover, rather than prison. The prison system is not the correct place to send somebody who is so mentally ill. But that is a story for another day.
Harvey, are you okay? Sorry, listeners. Harvey is just gesturing to me and he looks quite panicked. Who's here? Carrying what? Covered in blood. Oh my God. Harvey, barricade the door. Listeners, if someone could call the police, that would be greatly appreciated. She's getting in.
Good evening, darling Priscilla.
Who are you?
You should know there's a power in a name, so I think I'll keep quiet if it's all the same. I know you're looking for someone to blame, but to me this life is but a game.
I've heard that voice before.
Darling Priscilla, you have indeed. You don't believe in monsters, but we've all been freed. You have your doubts. I planted the seed. When I am done, this world will bleed.
Could you stop rhyming, please?
Fine.
Is there a name I can call you?
I think when you last mentioned me, you called me Beatrix, or rather, that's what you called the sack of skin and blood and bone. Pathetic as she was, she'd always sit and cry and moan. But I think I like the name Trix, let it be known, and...
You're rhyming again.
Oh, so I am. It appears to be a difficult habit to break.
You said I called you Beatrix. You are Edith. You look different to how I remember you.
I am not, and have never been Edith. She is simply a convenient host. She's human and A-positive, my favourite blood type. And look at how curly her hair is.
You are not possessed by a demon. Please, let us get you some help.
Oh, I'm afraid there's no helping this vessel anymore. She is quite dead.
This delusion isn't healthy. You're hurting people. You're hurting yourself.
I am not human. I don't need therapy or a tiresome doctor. No relaxation or restitution. I am a demon, a skinwalker, a mind killer. There's no cure for me.
You said you were human. In the letter, you said you used to be human.
I suppose that was a bit misleading. She was not me, or rather, she was me, but I was not her. Sometimes even I fail to make the distinction.
You've gone mad.
I know madness quite well, but she hasn't taken my mind yet. I don't know whether to be thankful or fearful.
Are you sure your mind is intact?
Darling Priscilla, I think I'm quite fond of you. You know, I've never had a real friend.
Really? I can't imagine why.
Now, Priscilla, don't be rude. I think our quality time is coming to an end in just a moment.
What? What are you going to do?
Nothing. I've done all I need to do. For now.
Don't move.
I would never. I promise.
Did you know you're still recording?
Oh, dear listeners, you probably realise this, but allow me to confirm that Edith Horn, or Trix, as she has been calling herself, has been arrested. Our streets are safe. Safer once more. Thank you for listening, and sleep well, dear listeners.
The voice of Priscilla Phantom was Lyndsey Evans. The voice of Trix, the demon, and the unnamed police officer was myself, Sasha K Williams. This podcast was written, produced, and edited by Sasha K Williams. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Phantom Myth. Hope you enjoyed it. You know that squeaky floorboard in your house? Did you just hear it? Aren't you home alone? Have a mundane day. Not boring, but not too interesting.